This will be our first part of an ongoing discussion on propaganda. And we've been taking a look last this week and last week on the discussion of what is art. And today we're going to be taking a look at propaganda and the art of propaganda and how this will help us to develop a language for understanding what propaganda is, its effects, and being able to then have a common language to be able to then identify and to talk about it throughout the semester. So this will be a foundational lecture for the rest of the semester that we can refer back to. This is going to, these lectures for propaganda are going to correlate with this handout here, which I will put on Canvas for you. And so I'm going to go through these terms to develop your language on propaganda. And I'll just go through the terms. I'll try to do this as quickly as I can so we can get through the assignment. But then you can just print this off or have it on your laptop and fill in these terms as we go along. And this will help you not only in the class, but also help you on upcoming tests as you might see some of these ideas again. Taking a look at the word propaganda, the word propaganda really originates from the Middle Ages with the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church used the term propaganda as a way of promoting the church's ideas. And so, in a lot of ways, propaganda just had its origins on spreading the message of the gospel to the world. And the idea of propaganda generally has more of a negative connotation to it, and certainly there are some components to that make it negative, but it's not inherently negative, right? There's some positive elements that you can use propaganda for good, and you can always still use it for evil. Taking a look at this image here, this is Brunelleschi's dome in Florence. Cathedrals were a way of creating propaganda, and Brunelleschi's dome is along those lines. The whole idea of a cathedral for your town was to have a bigger, better cathedral than your neighboring town. So this will be kind of your brass ring, or this will be your kind of claim to fame. And what makes Florence so famous was that Brunelleschi designed this dome here, which no other cathedral in Europe was able to replicate because they didn't know how to create a dome because they couldn't compensate for the hoop stress. And if you're more interested in that, I suggest that you take Humanities 202, Renaissance to Modern, because it actually is a very interesting story. But art also has this kind of correlation to propaganda, that Florence was the kind of the center of the Renaissance, and as the center of the Renaissance, as becoming the cultural and economic capital of the world during the Renaissance, during the 14 and 1500s, it wanted to promote art. And part of the promotion of art was to say how great their town is in comparison to another town. And so they went to Michelangelo and they asked Michelangelo to create David. And David has become this symbol of Florence because, much like the story of David, Florence saw themselves as the underdog, constantly overshadowed by Rome, by the Catholic Church. And what they wanted to do, much like David, is they wanted to defeat the Goliath of Rome. And so they went to Michelangelo and they said, hey, we want you to create David for the town. And originally they were going to put it on the top of the cathedral dome. And so that's why Michelangelo's David is so large. It's about 17 feet, and then the base adds another about 5 or 6 feet tall. And so it makes it extremely immense and kind of intimidating as you walk in to see it. And I've talked about that in a previous lecture. But when they saw the finished product and the greatness of Michelangelo, they decided that I don't know why the slide keeps moving. Anytime I touch the mouse, it goes back. Sorry about that. They took a look at Michelangelo's finished piece here, and they said this can't go on top of the cathedral. Instead, what they want to do is they want to put it out in front of City Hall, right? So thinking about that in terms of a message, right? If you put it on top of a cathedral, it's a religious message about how we as individuals need to be like David and have his faith, and we can overcome all the adversity in our lives. But you put it out in front of City Hall, that's a political message. It's a message to show to the rest of the world how great Florence has become. And so art has constantly had an interesting intersection with propaganda. We see similar ideas here. This is St. Ignatius Loyola and his ascension into heaven. And so we see him at the very center. St. Ignatius Loyola was the founder of the Jesuits, and the Jesuits were the missionary branch of the Catholic Church. And so they had the painter come and paint this on a cathedral in Rome during the Reformation, right? So you have John Calvin in Switzerland and Martin Luther in Germany, kind of curbing the authority of the Catholic Church. And what they decided to do is they said, well, we're going to go out and convert other parts of the world, the four corners of the world, in Asia and the newly discovered New World, and in the Americas. And we're going to bring the message of Catholicism to them. And so St. Ignatius Loyola was a big part of that, right? The idea of taking the gospel to the world. And so here they commemorate him and being able to be ascended into heaven. And you have Christ here on a cross descending down to welcome him into heaven. And then each one of these pillars represents the four corners of the world. And so this is again a political message, even though it's done by the Catholic Church. The message here is, yeah, it might be nice that that Luther is in Germany or Calvin's in Switzerland, but we actually, have the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and so in your face, and we actually have this widespread influence throughout the world, and so this is kind of that message of the power of the Catholic Church. But art has also been used for political reasons as well. This one I found when I went to visit Versailles a couple of years ago. I went through the gardens, and so here you see, the Versailles, and this is the gardens that they have here. And what we see within this is not only a message of art, but it's also a message of the gods, right? And so it's kind of interesting because you go to Versailles and you see how they were living, and they were living in this kind of absolute palace, this paradise, this kind of heaven on earth. Meanwhile, the people of France were starving and had a hard time finding, food. And so the political leaders had to find a way to justify their, elaborate living versus their subjects not being able to find food. And so here we see that kind of message. Well, so you see some gods coming down here and living in the lap of luxury, and isn't that great? And then you have like these little baby angels coming down and enjoying the revelries and kind of enjoying life. And so they're suggesting that the political leaders are kind of like gods, and they deserve to have more than the actual people, right? And so this is the Palace of Versailles. It's just extremely huge, right? 551,000 square feet. It is immense, and you compare that, right? Most average homes in the U.S. are about 2,000, 2,500, maybe 3,000 square feet. Some are a little bit bigger, but I mean that's a lot of houses that you can fit within this one palace. And this was just one palace that the king and queen had, and this was their vacation, their modest vacation getaway. And mainly what they would do is they have parties, and then they would invite dignitaries and royal families throughout Europe to come and stay with them. And so it's essentially a large hotel. And then the king and queen got so overrun with so many people there that they decided to go over, kind of in the gardens over here. This is the backyard, over kind of off in the gardens. And then they built their own kind of vacation getaway over there. So you have the king and queen's palace within the palace grounds here. And so again, it's a huge place, and they got to find ways to justify it, and they decorate it with the art around here with the sculptures showing mythological scenes, the stories of Western civilization, but then equating that to this is the way we deserve to live like this, right? So art has become used as a propaganda means to justify those who are in power, to justify subjecting those who are not in power to their rule. I wanted to start our propaganda discussion as we take a look at, the term, where the term originates and how it intersects with art by taking a look at government. Interesting enough, because propaganda does have that affiliation with government. And Plato argued that there are essentially 5 governments that are in existence, or that can exist, or that tend to exist. He says the first one is an aristocracy. Aristocracy would be like the kings and queens that you would have, and they would be the ones that would rule. And so you'd have the educated elite rule over the masses, over the uneducated masses. You have a democracy where you have more of the military rule. This would be more like Cuba, where the military leaders rule with power and authority. A little bit also like North Korea, although North Korea might be more of an oligarchy. An oligarchy would be where the wealthy elite rule, and it's not necessarily kings and queens. It could be any kind of wealthy person, but the wealthy people are the ones that are kind of pulling the strings. And then you have a democracy. Democracy would be a direct rule by the people and the focus on political equality and freedom, the access to power. And then the final one would be a tyranny, which is a rule by force, which that's actually would be also maybe in part what North Korea might be as well, and maybe a little bit of Cuba, at least under Castro's rule. And so what I would like to have you do is just kind of stop the video for a minute, and I want you to think about which form of government best matches what we have in the United States. And so thinking about the United States, which one would you say would we match up best with according to Plato's Republic, right? Would we be where the educated elite rule, the military rule, the wealthy rule, the direct rule by the people and the focus on political equality and freedom, or rule by force? And so pause the video, kind of think about that, and then come back. All right, so just to dig deeper, again, I'm getting you guys to not accept things initially as they are. A lot of people would, and when they see this question, they would initially react, well, obviously we're a democracy because that's what we say we are, right? And then let's kind of push back on that and see if there might be some truth to that, but again, that might be an oversimplification. Let's take a look at our leaders, right? The U.S. presidents, as we start to question this, right? So this is George Washington's net worth. This is adjusted for the 525 million is adjusted for inflation, so that would be kind of more of in contemporary dollars, but that's what he would be worth, today if we were to adjust it for inflation. Let's take a look at some other presidents. Thomas Jefferson had a net worth of 212 million. John F. Kennedy had a net worth of $1 billion. He gained most of his wealth from his father, Joe Kennedy, who incidentally got most of his money from bootlegging during the Prohibition years in the United States. He was running alcohol from Canada to the U.S., and that's where they mainly get their money, and then they use that money to get into power. Then fast forward it to a little bit more recently, you have Bill Clinton, who had a net worth of $38 million. George W. Bush had a net worth of $20 million. And then you have Barack Obama, who has a net worth of $5 million. It's actually probably increased since he hasn't been president. And then you have Donald Trump, who has supposedly, I don't know, a net worth of $3.5 billion, although we don't really know because he doesn't release his taxes, and so we can only guess. But some guess that he has a net worth roughly of $3 billion. Some people say maybe $1 billion. Some people say maybe a little bit less. We don't really know, but that's the best guess. And so as we think about this, we think about, well, where are our leaders really coming from, right? Are they coming from the people, or are they coming from a specific group? And so that gets us to push past those initial knee-jerk reactions and think a little bit deeper about ideas and how ideas are shaping the way that we see the world. And again, when I present this, generally I get some pushback and say, yeah, but there's got to be some presidents that were poor, right? That come from the common class. And I'm like, okay, yeah, let's take a look at the poorest presidents, right? So these are the poorest presidents. Abraham Lincoln had a net worth of, if we adjust it for inflation, $1 million. Ulysses S. Grant, again, adjusted for inflation, he was one of the poorest presidents. He had a net worth of $1 million. And then Harry S. Truman had a net worth of, again, $1 million, right? So these are our poorest presidents. We have not had one that actually comes from, the working class, quote unquote. They're all coming from more of the wealthier class. And so then we have to think about, well, what does that mean, right? What's the significance of that? And what are we really? Are we truly a democracy, or are we something different, right? So I'm not going to pose, right? I'm not going to suggest that, you can kind of come to your own conclusion on that on your own, but I do want to complicate that just so we start to see past ideas rather than just accept them as is. And so just a couple of ideas to think about, right, as we go through this. I want to share some quotes with you to dig a little bit deeper. The Supreme Court, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Citizens United case, but essentially what the Citizens United case suggested is that corporations are people, sort of, and that corporations can fund political campaigns. So then we have to think about what might be some implications if corporations can fund political campaigns. Can they also have political influence? Is that going to start making the political waters, which are already murky, even murkier, right? The Supreme Court, in this recent Citizens United case, has enshrined the right of corporations to buy government by removing limitations on campaign spending. The personal and the political are today in perfect alignment. And so some of the concerns with removing restrictions on campaign spending is that means that only very wealthy people, first of all, can get into a political campaign, at least one that matters, right? And you can probably become a state or local, representative, which was fine, which is great. But if you want to get into Washington, it starts to take a lot more cash to get there. And it also is going to take a lot more interest from the corporations and private funding, which then is going to come with a little bit more of, we have an expectation of what we're going to get with the money that we're helping you to get elected. The personal and the political are today in perfect alignment. Virtually all U.S. senators and most of the representatives of the House are members of the top 1% when they arrive, are kept in office by money from the top 1%, and know if they serve the top 1% well, they will be rewarded with the top 1% when they leave office, meaning they're going to get jobs and whatnot, very cushy jobs or speaking assignments or whatever the case may be. And so this is a cartoon that depicts the problems with Citizens United and people that are just funding the campaigns. The question is whose interests are being served, right? Are they really speaking, as we see here with Hillary, is she really speaking for the voice of the people, or is she speaking for the voice of those that are funding her campaign to get her in power? And this cartoon has something, says something similar to that, right? Citizens United with all of the cash behind it. When we go to the voting booth, is our voice that's really being reflected, or is it the voice of the corporations who, although we have the right of free speech in the United States, is all speech equal or equally created? And so this is going to get us to think a little bit more about Huxley's argument. And I'm going to criticize both sides of the aisle. I'm not just going to criticize the Democrats. I'm not just going to criticize the Republicans. I'm going to criticize both of them because, in essence, both of them do have their own limitations and their own problems. And so if you're offended by me offending one side or another, just wait. I'll try to offend everybody by the end. But the idea is not to necessarily promote one specific agenda. I think too often in politics today, we think in dualistic or absolutist terms where we think, well, either you're all one or you're all the other. You're either an extreme liberal or you're an extreme, conservative. And, truth generally tends to be not within extremes. It tends to be somewhere in the middle. And so I'll try to kind of hit that middle line as much as I can. But if you take a look at this, right, this is a chart of the representatives and their net worth. And so you can find your state on there. You can take a look at your state representative and how much that state representative, their net worth is. And this gets us to think about, where are the people coming from and whose voice is really being, heard? Are the people from the upper class really going to know what it's like to be part of the working class, right? Or is it just going to be the advantages or the voice of the upper class that's going to be represented? And so is that a true democracy then, right? Joseph Goebbels was the minister of propaganda for the Third Reich for the Nazis. And as the minister of propaganda, right, he's the one that really streamlined propaganda, really created a frenzy in Germany, created a mindset. We'll take a look at that a little later in the semester. But he says, this will always remain one of the best jokes of democracy, that it gave its deadly enemies the means by which it was destroyed. And so he suggests that one of the greatest ironies of the 20th century was that Hitler was elected to power, right? So can democracy be hijacked? Sure, right? And so the question is, as we think about the United States, or as you think about your country, where you're from, can democracy be hijacked, right? And so then we think about these kind of governments. Do we truly have a democracy here, or do we have more of an oligarchy? And that's something that we can kind of think about. And Karl Marx said, and I know some of you kind of have some immediate knee-jerk reactions to the name Marx. People think that he's like one of the great Satans, but he actually has some interesting ideas. And if you actually do read his manifesto of the Communist Party, there's a lot of overlap between his ideas and the law of consecration, right? So just kind of take a look at that and on your own time and come to your own conclusion on that. But he says a true democracy can only be achieved through a classless society, meaning that if you really want a democracy where every voice is equal, you have to have everyone having an equal power. And if you have kind of an imbalance within the wealth, then you're going to have an imbalance in society. That the wealthy are always going to use their power, their wealth, to gain more power, right? Here's another quote to think about, right? Whether we can have true political equality. A national survey in 2009 found that the net worth of the median white household was 113,000 compared to 56,000, or sorry, 5,600, according to a Pew Research study for the median black household, right? So again, we have to think about, is there true equality? Moreover, since the 1970s, the United States has also witnessed a drastic increase in the imprisonment of the population of African Americans or American citizens of African descent, both absolutely and relatively to American citizens of European descent. And so, as we think about going to the voting box in November, we have to think about whose voice is being heard, right? And as we think about the injustice that's created within wealth, thinking about that in terms of race, if people that are more wealthy that are funding people to get into power, generally what they're going to want is that their particular group is going to get their needs met more than others, right? Because they want to have their voice. And so whoever has bigger money has a bigger voice. And so those that are more susceptible are going to have a smaller voice, a diminished voice within a democracy. So the question I want you to think about, and we'll probably get back to in one of our Zoom sessions, is can there be political equality without economic or social equality? And that's something we generally don't think about. We just think, well, in the United States, we have a democracy, so everything's equal, right? But is everything equal, right? Or is that just propaganda, right? So again, we have to think through that. Some terms as we get back to that sheet that I had you print out with all of the terms on it. This one here. Let's take a look at some of the terms as we go through, right? Ideology, if you take a look at the first three words, right, the root word is idea, and ology is any time you study something. So biology is a study of living organisms. Geology is a study, geo means earth, so it's a study of the earth. So ideology then would be the study of ideas, and more specifically where ideas come from. And this suggests that those in power create ideas to justify their power. And so what we're going to do in this class is we're going to constantly look at how those in power use their ideas to justify their power more, right? Hegemony is a dominant way of seeing the world. It is just kind of a dominant idea. And so as we see here, this is a good example. Norman Rockwell is a good artist, and he's also good at propaganda. We'll talk about that later. But what we see here, the hegemony that we see, a dominant way of seeing the world, is he suggests that this is the typical American family where you have they're sitting down to eat, they're all smiling, and they're getting ready for this wonderful feast, probably Thanksgiving or whatever, or maybe it's Sunday dinner. It doesn't really say. But again, we have to think about what are the ideas as we pull apart and dig deeper. Who's the one that's in charge, right? Who's the dominant power? Well, then you take a look at that. It's the man, right, who's presiding at the head of the table. Who's the one in the kitchen, right? And we think about that. So the typical American family has what? Has the man in power, has the woman kind of doing the work, and that's just, and it's just posed right in a way that's just the way it is. And then we dig deeper between this, and we have to think about, well, what socioeconomic class is this? These are not poor people. This is the middle class, and so the average person, the average typical American family would be a middle class family where the man's kind of at the head, the breadwinner, the woman's at home, and then we have to think about this one layer deeper. The typical American family is white, and so then we start to think that hegemony, without even posing that right as an idea, he just kind of subtly suggests that this is the typical American family without thinking about what that actually means or what that actually implies. And most of us just kind of swallow that hook, line, and sinker and think, well, that's just the way it is, right? But that's what I'm trying to get you to move beyond, right? Or this one here, kind of the typical American, kind of average American town with the Andy Griffith Show, just kind of shows this kind of white town where they don't really have a lot of racial complexity or racial diversity. And they are generally in this kind of small rural community, right? So that is what is coded as typical. So we have to then think about what is typical and kind of pull that apart. Status quo is a term that refers to the current state of society. Those in power try to preserve the status quo because it benefits them, right? They're in power, so why would you question they're in power? So they wanted to make sure that the status quo was not messed with, right? Traditionally, those in power tend to be politically conservative because they don't like change. Because conservatism emphasizes tradition and maintaining the current equilibrium. On the other hand, those not in power tend to be more liberal, right? Politically liberal, because they emphasize change and disrupting the equilibrium. Right, and so that's a way to think about those in power. This is not a Democrat or Republican issue, because as opposed to today, historically Republicans have been more liberal and Democrats have been more conservative. Particularly if you take a look at the South during the Civil Rights Movement, the ones that wanted to preserve the status quo were Southern Democrats. Right, those that didn't want equal rights for African Americans were Southern Democrats. And so they wanted to be more conservative about the way that they were doing. And it was actually the Republicans that kind of came in and said, you know what, we need to change. And now that's been flipped, right? Since the 1980s with Reagan, by and large, Republicans have now gained more kind of an upper hand in the three branches. And so they tend to be more conservative and not wanting to change. And so it's not a Democrat Republican thing, although that's the way it's framed within the media. That's the way it's framed within the political discourse. It's a little bit different than that, and we need to kind of push beyond those kind of dualistic mindset. But this is where propaganda kind of comes from, right? Or we also see with family ties, the typical American family, again, white, middle class, right? The father's working. Actually, in this one, Elise does go to work too, but she also mainly is at home. Taking a look at social conditioning. Social conditioning is the adoption of social beliefs, social ideas, patterns of behavior through influencing elements such as education, popular culture, family life, or religion. So social conditioning is a way of teaching people the norm, how they're supposed to do something. And so the idea here is, as we take a look at a classroom, typical, I know kind of we long for the days of face-to-face classes, but in a typical classroom, I don't have assigned seats, but what I'll notice is that everyone comes in and sits in the exact same seat every single day, right? And some people don't, right? There's always one or two that try to buck the norm, but most people do come in and sit in the same seat every single day. And the question is, well, why is that? Well, if you go back to early in the schooling, you had assigned seats and you just learned that was your seat for the day or seat for the semester or whatever, and that's where you sat, right? So part of social conditioning is there's the behaviors that we adopt without really even thinking about them, right? But these could be behaviors in our church practices. We can have some social conditioning and how we teach others to behave, our kind of social norms that we adopt. It can be within our families, the social conditioning that we have within our families. It could be social conditioning within society, right? So one of the social conditioning that we notice with last couple lectures have been the social conditioning of what is beauty, right? So the standard beauty, teaching us what beauty is from early childhood up until adolescence and then adulthood, suggesting that these are the ideals, these are the standards that we should all aspire to do. And so that's another part of social conditioning. And it also leads us into this idea of a social construct, right? A social construct are ideas that are pushed by society to a point that we tend not to question them. We do not question where they come from, right? We simply accept them as natural and unchangeable. We don't really think about them. Race is a good example of this. We tend to see race as skin color in the United States, at least. But other countries, for instance, like Puerto Rico, I had a friend, one of my good friends came from Puerto Rico, and she said that because the different skin colors that are there, they don't define race based on skin color. They define it instead based on hair texture and how fine the hair texture is. That's down there. So we tend to think in the U.S. that race is mainly based on skin color. But that's just a social construct, right? So that's just something that the United States has said, hey, this is what we're going to say. And then we're going to base our kind of a feeling of superiority based on that. And so these are all human-created things, and they're not divine and biological, even though we tend to think that they are, right? We tend to think that race is biological when it's actually not. Another social construct is kind of within the church, Here we see the passing of sacrament. The social construct is that everyone that's passing the sacrament should wear a white shirt, when that's really just a social construct, right? There's no commandment for that. It's not written on tablets of stone or anything. It's just something that we tend to do, and without really thinking about it. And some wards are more strict than others, but it's more of a custom than it is a commandment. But it's a social construct. Taking a look at two ideas that we need to know about as we move forward is the base and the superstructure. The base is the economic system, whether that economic system is capitalism as we have in the United States, or whether it's socialism as we see in Europe, or whether it's communism that we see in North Korea and Cuba and Venezuela, is the economic system of any given society. So it's how goods and services are produced and distributed. What's more important about this is the superstructure. The superstructure are ideas, rules, laws that help to regulate the base. And so what this suggests is that every society, depending on what the base is going to have different laws and different rules, different customs because of the base. For instance, right? So if I was to go into a classroom and leave my laptop, right, in a capitalist society, and then someone was to come into that classroom afterwards and pick up my laptop and carry it home, what would we call that, right? In a capitalist society where we have the focus on private property, we would call that stealing. But if we change that to another society, such as like a communist society, and I left that laptop in the room and someone came up and picked it up and took it home, right? If it truly was a communal society, that wouldn't be considered stealing. It would be considered borrowing, right? And so it's a different kind of, according to the base, you're going to have rules and laws that are different from it, right? Another example of this, some of you are familiar with, in the early 2000s, there was what's known as Napster. Napster was a file sharing software or file sharing website where people can go on and download different music. However, the music industry didn't like that because that was their private property. They weren't getting their fair share, their cut of the deal, so they sued Napster, and it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, because it's focused on the base, right? The rule of the land is private property. They decided to close down Napster, and then Apple came in and filled that gap with selling music for $1 a song, right? So everyone was kind of happy with that, right? But the idea of capitalism is that the ideas, the rules, the laws, even the media are going to help to preserve whatever the base is. And so what we see in the United States is kind of signs like this, right? With private property, no trespassing, we don't call 911. This property is protected by the Second Amendment, right? So my property, to get off it, is kind of the mindset. Or we see this starting to influence art with Andy Warhol, where he starts to celebrate, capitalism with this Campbell soup cans. Where it's different in the Soviet Union. This is Soviet Union art where they're focusing more on community. They're focusing more on people working together. It's a different emphasis. I don't know if you've ever seen this film. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But it does demonstrate kind of the ideas that of the superstructure that it exists. It's not as though the government is creating, the media, the films. They just exist because the ideas exist, right, in society. So it's separate. These are so ingrained within society that they can be separate from the government, but the government doesn't have to produce them. But and where the heart is, what you have is Natalie Portman becomes pregnant, and then her kind of scuzzbucket of a boyfriend leaves her one day at a Walmart when she's like 9 months pregnant. She has no home. She has nowhere to go. She has no car. And so she kind of lives in Walmart at night. This was before the 24 hours Walmart. Actually, we're no longer in 24 hours Walmart now because of COVID. But anyway, this was before the 24-hour Walmart. And so they would close at night. And she would just kind of hide in the bathroom or in the dressing room. And then she would just kind of sleep there. And then she came to terms. She had her baby in Walmart. And then the story broke, and rather than getting arrested, they gave her a job, they gave her a home, right? So the idea, the message of this is a capitalist message that if you are without a home, naturally, private businesses like Walmart will make you a home. They'll make you comfortable, right? They'll provide for you, which that's a gross oversimplification of what actually happens. But even in things like movies with Natalie Portman. We have the base that's going to be supported, and so we see that within almost all films are going to go back and to support the idea, and even films that start to question it question what the society, and you see people going through hard times, eventually the hard times are overcome, which suggests that even though we're living in an imperfect world, the system is perfect and it will eventually correct itself. Taking a look at blind certainty is a closed mindedness where the mental imprisonment is so absolute that people do not know that they are locked up. And so it's a blind way of seeing the world, that the people are so kind of ingrained within the way of seeing the world that they don't even realize that they're imprisoned, right? And so this is an image of the Third Reich, and certainly the people that were there, the soldiers and the citizens, were so ingrained that they didn't even see what they're doing was wrong, right? And they didn't question it. And if they did question it, they were maybe too afraid to speak out against it. And so we have to question ourselves of whether we're living with this blind certainty, if our minds are so closed that we don't even know that we're locked up, right? One way that I kind of think about this away from the Third Reich, I'm kind of more of a silly example than the weightiness of Nazi Germany would be in Rexburg, right? And in Rexburg, you guys are lucky that you're not here during the winter because the plowing of the roads here is horrific, right? They generally don't plow the roads. What they do sometimes, kind of hit and miss, is they will kind of smooth the roads. They'll kind of smooth the snow down, and then we drive on it and it packs really hard, so it becomes like ice. And then when it starts to warm up, the ice melts underneath our tires, and then it freezes, and then it becomes huge ruts, and then we have these huge bumps, and it's completely horrific. And if you talk to anyone who has lived in Rexburg their entire lives, you say, hey, this is a problem, this is not the way it is. I lived in Nebraska, I lived in Michigan, they actually did plow the roads there, and you can actually drive on blacktop. They have no idea what you're talking about. They just think, yeah, that's just the way it is, that's the way it's supposed to be. Why are you complaining? That's just, that's called winter, right? And when the truth of the matter is, it's really not winter. I wanted to show you this clip from Elf, which helps to illustrate what blind certainty is with Buddy.
Think you can help me pick up the slack on those etch sketches?
No problem.
I appreciate it. Buddy's killing me. I only got one limited choo-choo pulling doubles.
Quick thinking yesterday with that special talents thing.
I feel bad for the guy. Just hope he doesn't get wise.
Well, he hasn't figured out he's a human by now. I don't think he ever will. He hasn't figured out he's a human by now. I don't think he ever will.
I think they're too small.
Just
Peter, not so good, buddy. Are you okay?
I'll be okay. I just need a glass of water.
So what we see with Buddy is this idea that he was so kind of certain that he was an elf that when he found out he wasn't, it completely, shattered his worldview. And I've noticed that some students throughout the semester, they tend to express similar ideas to me when they start seeing the world differently, right? They start to question a little bit more about how their ideas have been shaped by others, and they start to kind of see beyond them. And so, but blind certainty is just the sense of that we're so certain that that's the way the world is that we don't tend to question. So what we're going to do this semester is question that idea. Taking a look at persuasion. Persuasion are ideas that are designed to shape our perceptions, designed to change our perceptions, right? And so, for instance, with Giacometti's The Walking Man, it's getting us to think about, who we are and think about overcoming adversity, think about the Holocaust, right? Think about all those ideas and how we are to move forward. I ran across this particular image at the Salt Lake Contemporary Art Museum a couple of years ago. This was by a Middle Eastern artist, and she wanted us to think about the effects of American consumerism, Americans' addiction to oil, and how that's influencing her culture back home. And this is kind of interesting because in the West we tend to read from the the left to the right, which kind of has an interesting this is called the evolution of man, which kind of has an interesting evolution, right? But in Arabic, they read from the right to the left, and so it has kind of a different meaning associated with it, right? Just some thoughts to consider as we begin our discussion about what is propaganda.